So I was just looking back at, when your first book was published, which was in 1998. So it's a good 2 decade plus. How has it been? And it's been 2 decades of not just books, but also art and photography, music, an entire gamut. Has it gone as planned?
So I had one great gift, which was that there's only one thing I can really do. I'm totally innumerate. I can't add up. Mm-hmm. And I could never, I've got no sense of timing, so I would never have held down a job as a management consultant or a banker. Or, I think that's always sort of clarified things.
Lucky for us, lucky for all the readers.
I always knew there was one thing I could do, which was to write, so I sort of stuck to that.
Mm-hmm. So what drew you to go on this road trip along the Silk Route all the way to Xanadu then?
So I was very lucky. I went to this college at Cambridge, which invested its wealth in something in the docks in Felixstowe, and it was a kind of incredibly successful investment for the college, which meant that it became the richest college in either Oxford or Cambridge, and it used to try and devise ways of getting some of this wealth to its students. When you passed the eating hall, there were always these posters up on the wall for this and this prize, this and this travel grant. And if you applied to these things, there was money. Mm-hmm. And I remember just before my second year exams, passing this thing, something called the Guyard Lapsley Travel Prize. And Guyard Lapsley was some old don who died and left money for this prize. And it was for travel by medieval historians. And I knew there were only 3 medieval historians in college. So it seemed a bit silly not. So I then went to the library and thought, what's the longest medieval journey you can do? And it worked out that Marco Polo was probably the longest. So I could apply for the largest possible grant. And I did that. And then after exams, I remember going back to my room, there's been this note put under my door saying you've got £750 to do Marco Polo's journey. And at this point, for the first time, the penny dropped. I was actually going to have to do this. I'd put in without any sort of real conviction of doing the journey or that I would get the prize. So I found I suddenly was in this situation where I had to go and follow Marco Polo's route in my summer holiday. And it was a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful journey. And nothing I've ever done subsequently in travel has matched that. Starting in Jerusalem, through to Cyprus, then through Syria, which was then pre-war, amazing country, through Turkey, Iran, up the spine of Pakistan, up the Karakoram Highway, which had just opened that year, into Western China, through Xinjiang, down the Silk Route, up through Xi'an to Beijing, and then into Mongolia.
How long was this
total
journey?
Dream. What?
How long was this journey?
This was. I had 3.5 months before I had to get back to college.
Wow.
So
you covered this distance in 3.5 months. Yeah. Wow.
Hitching and that sort of.
Wow. And for a long time before now you're known as a historian, but before that you were known as a travel writer, and that's what brought you to Delhi, didn't it?
Sure. What brought me to Delhi was before all this. I spent my year off before college in Delhi working and teaching history. And that was when I had no particular interest in this country and no link with it as far as I knew.
I'm sorry, the sound is not reaching at the back, so...
My one or both of us? Can you hear that? Yeah. So I spent a year there before college and went straight back afterwards, having written in Xanadu, and then began work on the second book, City of Jinns. As a young man, to be a travel writer when you're young, free, and single is the most wonderful thing. But by the time that kids had turned up, the last thing you want to do is be wandering around Afghanistan when you've got a young baby at home. and I'm not sure my wife would have been particularly keen on me missing 9 months of nappies to go off. And so I sort of changed career mid-30s and wrote White Mughals as a history book. And since then, I've been doing that. But I think quite keen to go back to travel again now our kids have grown up.
You did sort of go back to 9 Lives after White Mughals.
9 Lives is the only thing that's been a bit travel-y. And I'd love to do a bit more of that, actually. I've just finished a huge, fat history book called The Anarchy, which is about the rise of the East India Company, which has taken 5 years. And I'd quite like not to do another history book now. I'd like to do something involving traveling. Just went with Uday yesterday to up Raigar and down to Janjira, and the pleasure of just being off on the road again after sitting at home writing footnotes.
I saw the photos on Twitter, and I wondered whether a travel book on Janjira was coming up.
Nothing planned, but something like, I mean, yeah, I'd love to get on the road again.
How wonderful. But these 4 books that you've written about Britain in India, I mean, what is called as the Britain in India Quartet, why were you drawn to these themes?
Well, specifically, it's the company. It's not Britain and India. And I've never written about, other than, even in this book, actually, I stop at Ranjit Singh, and it's Anita that does the Raj bit. I've never written about the Raj proper, which I think has been done to death 1,000,000 times. But I've always been fascinated by the twilight, this in-between period, between the death of Aurangzeb in 1707 and the 1857 uprising, which is what you find, I think, in this country is that there are people always hone in on the golden ages. So it's the golden ages of the Guptas, it's Ashoka, Shah Jahan, Akbar, Shivaji, and the bits in between sometimes fall through the cracks. And it's this extraordinary period when the company, which is a corporation, which comes out of one office block, and all 4 of the books, White Mughals, Last Mughals, Return of a King, and The Anarchy, are that story. They're all part of one narrative. They're not written in order. The Anarchy, which is the most recent one, is actually the prequel in a sense. It begins with the founding of the company in 1599, at the same time as Shakespeare's writing Hamlet in London. But this bizarre story, which has been sort of forgotten both in India and in Britain, because people still in both countries talk about the British conquering India, or the British ruling India, or colonizing India, or looting India. But it's not actually the British per se. It is a corporation. It's a big company. It's Facebook, it's Walmart, it's Google. And it's owned by shareholders. And this monstrous company has an army by the time of Chillianwalla, by the time it's taking the Sikhs on, which is double the size of the British army. It's like G4S, or one of these sort of security companies, having fighter jets and nuclear submarines today. And people have forgotten this. In a sense, we've nationalized the East India Company in a way it wasn't. It was a private company. And decisions about India's future that would affect millions of people, that would lead to starvation in Bengal or whatever it was, would be taken not in Downing Street by the government, by an elected government, but it was taken by the directors of the East India Company, who would be elected by the shareholders in the city, in Leadenhall Street. The building is underneath what's now the Lloyd's building in the City of London. And so that's what I've been working at, in the sense to try and, as soon as you realize that, everything looks slightly different. So something like we all hear about in the history books, when Clive takes the Diwani from Shah Alam. Now the Diwani means the right to tax collect and run the economy. And what it is, it's just outsourcing. It's what today, it's when a government, today in Britain, G4S now runs prisons that were formerly run by government prison warders. Now a private security company for profit runs these things. Now, the East India Company was the same idea on a vast, massive, transcontinental scale. And this one company not only loots, pillages, conquers India, but it uses it as a base for growing opium, which it sells to China. And then, whatever it is, 1/8 of the Chinese population become opium addicts. The biggest narco operation. And this is not, it's like a Netflix series. This it's not. It's not in any way being unhistorical to say that the East India Company was the biggest narco operation in history. It's an actual fact. Then from China it buys tea to sell to the British, but it's selling so much opium and buying so much tea that they can't get rid of this tea. So what do? They have to sell it to the Americans, and which is where the Boston Tea Party comes in. So this company is, it's destroying India, destroying China, and is about to sort of try its... and one of the things you find is that when the American Revolution takes place, one of the motivating factors is that they fear the East India Company is going to be let loose on them. The tea tax, that's what it's all about. It's East India Company tea. So suddenly, once you follow this trail, a lot of this history looks completely different. And it is a story in this age when we have surveillance capitalism, corporate lobbying, how the Ambani is going to affect the next election in this country, all these things. And this is that story 200 years ago. And the very first case of corporate lobbying in the world is in, I can't remember the exact date, let's say 1658, I think, when Parliament discovers that the East India Company, which is then only 58 years old, is bribing MPs to allow it to extend its charter. And this is the world's first case of corporate lobbying, and the way that corporate power can overwhelm a corrupt legislature. Which, think of the last elections, think of the Commonwealth Games. These are very, very current stories. And this is the history of that.
So you are a trained historian, and you've written these stories, and I'm sure there are more stories out there that you would want to return to at a later point. But why did you choose to write popular history, write in a popular way and not academically? Is it your personality?
So I wouldn't accept that distinction. Mm-hmm. Kohinoor was something that took a short time and is I would totally accept a popular history book. But the 4 books of this quartet are all 5-year projects. They take as long as a PhD. They've got pages of footnotes. And I think with history you have a choice, as you do with any form of literature. When you write a novel, you can choose to write your novel as a racy thriller, as chick lit, as a bit of incredibly serious post-modern, tricksy, literary, post-modernist, structuralist, colonial, magic realist, or you can write. You can try to be Tolstoy. It's up to you to choose what you want to do. The same is true of history. Once you've done your research, once you've spent your 5 years in the archives finding the primary sources, you have a decision. Do you write it in literary prose, or do you write it in academic prose for the benefit of your peers? So it seems to me the important thing as far as writing substantial history is concerned is not the language you write it in or the audience you address it to. It's the depth of your research and the new insights you're bringing to it. I've chosen to write it not academically, but I wouldn't describe these books as popular history. They win prizes, they get medals, and they attempt to do what the historians I really admire, people like Simon Sharma, Linda Coley. There's a guy that no one reads here, but who was a huge influence on me, called Sir Stephen Runciman, who wrote these incredible medieval histories about Byzantium and the Crusades, a 3-volume Crusade trilogy, The Fall of Constantinople, which is to use the highest academic standards of research and then combine it with the highest literary standards you can manage, and to take as much trouble with your language as a novelist would take. And so, no, I wouldn't regard this as popular history, but it is not written in academic prose, which one often finds, particularly I think in this country, with work, for example, by the subaltern studies groups, is almost sort of deliberately obscure in its diction, and in a sense tries to create academic distance between what's being written about and the actual subject. I think you can make yourself deliberately obscure for the sake of academic effect, while I think in the sciences there are things which cannot be described in plain language. If you're talking about rocket science, you need to use complicated language and equations and so on. But that's not the case when you're describing human matters. Language can be clear and can be comprehensible while describing the most complex things. And I certainly see it as my job, particularly when dealing with 18th century India, when all alliances are constantly changing and there's the politics are of unbelievable complexity, that the job the difficulty is to be clear. That to achieve clarity is an aim in itself.
And to write the kind of stories you've written, because so many of them have not been told before, you've also looked at sources that are very primary, that were in languages that we don't read in anymore. So how has your method been to research and to produce this amount of work?
So ever since White Moguls, I've, in a sense, played the same trick, which is, for the 18th century, many of the sources, not all, particularly here in Pune, Maratha sources are often in Marathi, but overwhelmingly in Mughal sources and elsewhere are in Persian, a language very few people now speak here. People's grandparents spoke it. As recently as 2 generations ago, when I first came to Delhi, one would meet old people in Delhi that still understood Persian, but today, very, very few. And so I work with the same Persian translator, a guy called Bruce Winnell. He comes to stay. We get the sources out of the British Library or wherever we find them. And for this current book, some of the best materials come from the library in Tonk, near Ajmer in Rajasthan. With the last Mughal, it was the National Archives. I worked with Mahmud Farooqi who can read this very difficult Shikasta script. And just in a sense, just by using these primary sources, which have been forgotten or just neglected in many cases, you instantly create a new level. With Return of a King, it was Afghan sources, also in Persian. I went to Kabul in 2007 and went to see the then Chancellor of Kabul University, a man called Ashraf Ghani. Mm-hmm. And he pointed me to one particular bookseller in a place called Jawi Shir, down in the old town, where there was this old bookseller who'd bought up all the aristocratic libraries from the Afghans, nobility and the upper middle class, as they were leaving when the Marxists came in. And he said, you will find anything you want there. And he gave me a shopping list of 10 sources for the first Afghan war. And I had 7 of them by lunchtime. It was the most successful morning of research of my entire life, I think, for which I thank Ashraf Ghani very much. So these things are there, and then get them translated. Meanwhile, work on the secondary sources, read through them all. I have a card index with the names of all the main characters, and so you gradually accumulate the details of the individual characters, which allows you to describe them. And I have a dateline with all the main quotes. So by the time that I actually start writing, everything it's rather like Chinese cookery. You spend years preparing it. A good Chinese cook will cut up all his garlic, cut up all his spring onions, put all the lamb into beautiful little cubes and marinate it, and then flash fry it very, very quickly in a wok. It's similar to I spend 4 years with the big books, cutting up the materials, getting them all nicely diced and marinated, and then flash fry them in 6 or 9 months if I can.
I think I have time for one last question before we open it up, right? Where's Khushru? Okay, because we are hitting 20 minutes now. But I wanted to ask you this. There have been times when people have said that, being an outsider writing about India, I'm sure you've encountered this at various levels in your career, and we've also seen the exchange between Ram Guha and following the Pankaj Mishra, the review you wrote of Pankaj Mishra's book. How does that make you feel? What do you feel that you're an English historian or a British historian or an Indian historian? What is the identity that you claim for yourself?
So first of all, I'm not English, I'm Scottish.
That's why I quickly corrected to British.
I won't call you a Pakistani.
I wouldn't mind though.
This has been my home now since I was 18. Mm-hmm. But I'm not Indian. So I'm both insider and outsider, I suppose. Which socially can be awkward at times. There are moments when you suddenly feel there's something you don't get. There's a reference or something that people make in conversation that even after 30 years you misconstrue or don't understand. But as a writer, I think it's quite a positive thing to be, in that you know what it's like when you go abroad for the first time or you go to somewhere new, you notice things that the insiders no longer see because they're so ordinary, so normal. They're so much part of your life. When I go to London, I don't notice the red pillar boxes or the red buses because they're part of the wallpaper of the place to me. They're unexceptional. I don't see them. And you do get a heightened perception when you go to somewhere that's new and different. And to a certain extent, India has still, after 30 years, remained full of, I mean, these are dangerous words, buzzwords, but exoticism, mystery, excitement. When we were yesterday climbing Rajghat, it was an incredibly exciting experience. It was absolutely wonderful. And I'd never been there before. And to see that landscape and suddenly to be able to fit into that landscape all the stories you knew of Shivaji's coronation or Afzal Khan and all the rest of it. So I think, as an outsider, you sometimes get things wrong, you miss things, you can misconstrue things, you can misunderstand things. But it also gives you a heightened perception. You see things that other people miss because they're too ordinary for them to see. And so it's a different perspective, certainly. And I don't think I'm alone like this. I mean, for example, where I come from Scotland, the great history books, which in a sense created the Scottish national movement, were by a Canadian called John Preble. And he wrote this series of books on Glencoe, Culloden, the Highland clearances, which totally changed Scottish politics because it made people aware of what they'd been through at the hands of the English. And it changed everything. Now, I'm not claiming to change people's perceptions in that way, but there is something that being an outsider can bring to the table. And you can see things and make connections, which perhaps less obvious to people that grew up with these things, if you're lucky.
On that note, I'll open it up to the floor now. I'm sure there are questions. There's one here. Please raise your hand so that I know how many are. Okay, all right. Khushru has a question, but there was a hand up here.
He's pointing to something.
Okay. All right. The person on stage, she would like to ask a question. So she put her hand up first. And nobody could see that, so I'm... You could take this.
Okay. Yeah. I can be loud.
No. Come forward, please. Come forward.
Thank you. So you mentioned a couple of names of people who write history in a non-academic way, and I personally feel, and I don't think many will disagree, that reading history and philosophy now is probably more important than reading math and science. So who are some of the authors that you would recommend?
For history? For history. In this country
yes.
or outside?
Top 5 list from anywhere, I suppose. An inclusive list would be nice.
So, I mean, I touched on this a minute ago when talking about the people that influenced the style of my history. A writer I just cannot recommend more enough is Sir Stephen Runciman. Runciman was a don at Cambridge, taught there for years, and then decided he couldn't write and teach. You had to, if you really wanted to write. So he went off to Scotland and lived in an old tower house and wrote these extraordinary books. And certainly, The Last Mughal is an Indianized rip-off of rather like one of those Bollywood films that takes a Hollywood plot and changes it slightly. The Last Mughal is very much inspired by The Fall of Constantinople, 1453, which is this extraordinary book about the last days of the Byzantines, with the Turks surrounding the city and the fall of this great empire and the destruction of a civilization. An incredibly moving and wonderful book. I love the work of Simon Sharma, Citizens, which is an extraordinary book on the French Revolution, which he did by going to provincial archives and finding the really kind of obscure stories of cake makers in Bordeaux and what happened to a vintner in Champagne and all the stories of the little people that had been ignored. And he weaves it again with this magnificent prose. Also, his Landscape and the Imagination is one of the great history books in my view. Linda Coley, Britons and Captives, 2 books which completely upend. Britons is about how Britain was created rather than England, Scotland and Wales, how the country was formed as a political project very consciously at the beginning of the 18th century with a particular group who had an interest in these countries coming together, bullying and pushing this very unpopular idea of creating a nation, and then, in a sense, terrorizing those who wanted to be Scots or British or English into being a united country. Who else? Amazing book on the 18th century, which I learned a lot from, a woman called Stella Tilliard, wrote a book called Aristocrats. She found that there were these 6 sisters who were all incredibly literate and wrote to each other every day for 40 years. One was married to an Irish revolutionary, one was married to a minister in the government, and they wrote to each other about their love affairs, their little personal difficulties, their ailments, and she managed to get inside. That kind of, it's getting inside people's heads, getting the biography and the out that's the challenge. Who else? Of my generation in Britain, Anthony Beevor, whose amazing books on the Second World War, Stalingrad, and again, he created a financial opportunity for writers of my generation because his books sold so well internationally. His first book, Stalingrad, sold 1 million copies. And when I was writing White Mughals, publishers were willing to take a punt on historians, I think, because of the way that he'd managed to make popular history. Make history. He got into the Soviet archives after the fall of the Berlin Wall and was able to tell this story in a way that had never been told before. Simon Sebag Montefiore, who's my exact contemporary, who's done amazingly well with both Russian and Middle Eastern history in the Romanovs. But there's also a whole load of young historians coming up in this country. You've got Manu Pillai coming here next week, who's an incredible writer and is only, whatever he is, mid-20s, but has written 2 extraordinary books. Ira Mukoti on Mughal women, Parvati Sharma, who I think is also coming here, talking on Jahangir, Ruby Lal on Nur Jahan. So there's a real change in the way history is being written, beginning, I think, here now, and these books are very much biographically centered, but written out of primary sources.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There was a question at the back, I think. Yeah.
Hello. Okay. So there's something I would say before asking the question. Firstly, I would like to appreciate your work, the way you're informing us about history, because we need history to know where we come from as a people and basically know where we need to go to. So that's what I wanted to say. The question is not from me, it's from a friend who couldn't make it to the talk because of his health. So the question basically what he wanted to ask is, what according to you is the next gem that comes after the Kohinoor in terms of value and history? So if you could answer that. Thank you.
What's the next gem?
What's the next gem?
What is the most expensive or most...
in terms of value and also history.
So now, I mean, again, this is... I forgot to say this during the talk. The Kohinoor is not even in the top 100 of gems in its current diminished size. At 95 carats, I think it now stands at about 120 on the list of gems. So the largest remains the Cullinan, which is still by far the largest gem in the world, and it's in the same case as the Kohinoor in the Tower of London. The prettiest gem, I think the Darya-Noor is the one everyone here forgets about. It's larger than the Kohinoor, always was larger than the Kohinoor. And it's sitting in Tehran, in the treasury there. Again, a pink Golconda, flat Golconda stone of immeasurable value, but incredibly gorgeous stone. So So if I was allowed to steal one stone, I might, not the Kohinoor, I would probably do a heist on the Dalrymple, I think.
Okay, we got this.
Hi. So I was actually just putting a couple of things together that you had mentioned. One was about facts being less important than opinions. One was her question about how natural sciences are perhaps not as exciting, which I don't agree to because I'm a scientist. And the fact that you're going to be talking about this very period that you said was the anarchist period. And I think science does play a very important role in exactly that time. And a lot of historians and a lot of writers tend to, really diminish its role because I think, as you said, the swiveled guns that they had, and a lot of things really changed because of the science and how it came in. And even scientists try to kind of undermine the politics of science, if you say so. Most scientists will say science has no politics, which is, in my opinion, not entirely true. Could you just comment on that, maybe?
Well, I wouldn't say that science is boring at all, no. I'm very excited by the way that popular science has also taken off as a genre. Writers like Simon Singh, Marcus de Sotoy are incredible writers, and certainly at the Jaipur Festival we tried to bring as many of them as we can. Also, the history of science is a fascinating story, and one of the books which created the beginning of this wave of non-fiction 20 years ago was Longitude, the story of the discovery of how you calculate longitude. An obscure topic, but one that went on to sell more than 1 million copies. So no, I think just as history can be written obscurely, and, if you like, boringly, and with deliberate obscurantism, so the project of trying to make science comprehensible, interesting, readable, is a very difficult one, but one that many writers are carrying out and pulling off now. And I think when it's well done, good popular science books can be extraordinary.
I'm more interested in the links between the history and science, because I think science, separately, as you said, there have been several exciting people, but actually bringing the two together about how the science influences the history that you write about. I mean, how that's being maybe addressed in the course.
Well, I think obviously there are some subjects which lend itself to that conjunction. I'm not a scientist and have no scientific pretensions or knowledge, so so it's not something I've tried to do. I suppose if I'm trying to do anything, I'm mixing history and art history, and which are the other things I write about. But no, I think it's an important project, and more power to it.
Hi, William. Last Mughal was the first book I read on history, and I haven't stopped since. So when I read your books, I go through a lot of emotions, especially with City of Jinns, where you've mentioned about Punjabis and Sikhs, and even with the last Mughal, the way the last emperor was buried. All of these, they make you feel a lot sad, and it literally broke my heart. But as an author, you would have gone through tons of materials and so many datas and things. How did you feel coming across these kind of data? What was your emotional level then?
Well, when you're a writer engaged in a project, there's two things. On one hand, you only take on a subject, presumably, if you're actually really interested in it. And when you begin a book, if it's going to be a huge project like the East India Company, it's going to take you 5 years, you better be interested in it, because you'll be sitting reading it, night and day for the foreseeable future, for the equivalent of an entire school career, or But you also are the hunter, and even when you come across some incredibly gruesome description that makes you sad, there's also a bit of you that's saying, yes, this is going to be a fantastic story. Like when you discover about the maggots falling out of Musharraf Dali's nose, you just know that you're going to be using this, however disgusting or upsetting it may be, that this is going to get the groan from the audience when you give the lecture.
So
we have time for 2 more questions.
Yeah,
There's one
this
here.
side of the room, I think we need to fan out.
We're going to do one here and then one.
Yeah.
Hi, William. I have a question. West, in terms of organizing its archives and historical references, is pretty organized, whereas in India, it's spread all over the place. So how do you manage that and the difficulty of getting to the right sources, getting the right information? Because it could be spread all over the place.
So yes, you're right. There's a wonderful search engine which I was telling Uday about yesterday, which called the National Register of Archives, which has collated into one website a historical search engine which allows you to put in any name of any historical character, and that will come instantly all the holdings in any British public collection. So you can, anyone you're researching that has any collection in Britain, even if it's someone outside Britain, even if it's Ranjit Singh or Ahmed Shah Durrani, you can find in 30 seconds every single public holding in a government archives with the references and hyperlinks so that you can actually write to the library there and then and request copies and stuff. So it's incredibly easy to do it that side. The challenging and the interesting thing, though, is to do it here, whereas you say things are often more inaccessible, less well catalogued, more confusingly distributed around the country. But that's also, on the plus side, where you'll find the new material. The miles and miles of East India Company records in the British Library are wonderful, but you'll be quite lucky if you find something that no one else has found. While there's huge opportunities to find new things in the National Archives, or equally the Pune Daftar, where all the Maratha archives are. It's possible to rewrite history here in a way that's not possible in some areas. For me, the most exciting thing of all was the mutiny papers in the National Archives when I was doing the last Mughal. And it had become a commonplace that there were no records of the mutineers. And there, sitting in the National Archives, the most obvious place in the country, were 20,000 documents of the mutineers in Delhi. And that was the basis for writing the last Mughal. Now, it's extremely unlikely that you'd make an equivalent discovery in Paris. So while there are frustrations working in Indian archives, there are also huge excitements. And I think anyone that has worked in archives here, can be initially, as always with anything Sarkari in this country, the knocking your head against the wall when you first get there, the babus who won't take your application, the early closing, all the usual stuff. But once you actually get in and begin to mine the stuff, even more so in Pakistan, which is or Afghanistan, which are 2 or 3 stages down the same route. Pakistan, the main Punjab archives, where the entire records of the court of Ranjit Singh are kept, is within the Central Secretariat, which is a high security thing. So you can't actually get into the archives to apply to use it unless you have a sort of invitation from the archives already. So it's a chicken and the egg thing. It's almost impossible for any researcher to get into the archive to use it because you need a security pass to get in. So if you can get in there, if you know someone, I happened to meet someone, managed to use it for both White Mughals and Last Mughal and Return of a King. The stuff in there has been read by almost no one, and whatever you find will be new, and it's very, very exciting. But it's the same thing. The greater the difficulty, the more likely it is to be new and exciting.
One last question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, here. Hi, William. You talked about the death and destruction caused by the Kohinoor. Would you comment on a possible connection between the Kohinoor and Brexit?
I think this is clearly the last. This is why you guys really don't want it back. you've got quite enough on your plate already. You know? One more.
Yeah. This will be the last question, Khushru.
I just wanted, so in this age, I think everyone's commented on how the reading of history now is perhaps more important than it ever was, in India as well as in the rest of the world. As a historian, what would be your advice to, say, an enthusiastic but lay and therefore untrained historian, I mean, somebody who's interested in history but not trained in the reading of it? What would be your advice to them? Because we find so often now that myth overwhelms facts. And so, you know, and also one is sort of inundated with information, historical or otherwise, from everywhere. And to sort of sift through that and, what would be your advice to somebody who's reading that now and to find veracity, really, in what they read?
So not an easy question to answer. It's the same answer that one should give, I think, with news and fake news, is that you have to trust the source. So when I see on someone's Facebook wall a story, if it comes from sort of jojo.com or something, you don't automatically assume that it's going to be true. But if it comes to the New York Times,
right,
or the Guardian, it doesn't necessarily mean it's right, but it means that it'll have gone through a certain degree of fact-checking before it's made it on. And you do the same with history. You find reputable historians, historians who have been trusted, whose books or articles are well thought of widely, and you use your judgment to see who you can trust. It doesn't mean that everything they write will be right, and that's why each generation rewrites history. Is that historians make errors, they fail to. And every single exercise of writing a history book is slightly like being a judge in a court case. You're presented with conflicting evidence, and at the end of the day, the judge or the jury has to make the decision on which of these different accounts is the most likely to be true. And often you can make the wrong decision. Something turns up later to prove that the key fact that someone used actually was a later document or a fake or something. So it isn't an easy thing, but you have to keep reading, use your discrimination, and go to reputable sources. And always, when you see something from some dodgy website, don't believe it until you read the same thing somewhere else.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, William. This was... It has been a very illuminating, and thank you for an illuminating talk and for this engaging discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us. Khushru, can I pass on the mic to you, please?
William, thanks so much for your generosity in spending time with us, coming. William has been here. He's come literally just to be with us. He's spent... he was generous enough to accept our invitation. He said yes right away. We booked his tickets, and it was just, thanks so much for coming. William's wife is here, Olivia. She's an artist. Thank you so much for coming. We hope to have you back again and sharing your new book with us at some point, and we'd love that. Thank you all for coming. Just one more announcement. We've got dealing with history. We've got, as William said, we've got Manu Pillai coming on the 9th. That's going to be at the Loft. And we've got Parvati Sharma. She's written a book on Jahangir. So these are both two young, exciting historians. Hope to see you all there. If you all want to be on our mailing list, there's a little write-up outside. There are some cards. You can sign up. There's going to be time to take pictures and book signings. So have a great evening. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks, William.